Welcome, everyone. I'm quickly going to introduce our speaker. Michael Plant is the founder and director of the Happier Lives Institute, a non-profit research institute that searches for the most cost-effective ways to increase global well-being. Michael is also a research fellow at the Wellbeing Research Center at the University of Oxford. He has a PhD in philosophy from Oxford, and his thesis entitled Doing Good Badly, Philosophical Issues Related to Effective Altruism was supervised by Peter Singer and Hilary Greaves. And his talk today will be about taking happiness seriously.
Thanks everyone for coming. To those of you who came to my other talk a couple of hours ago, thank you for coming back. Very brave of you. Okay, so as the title of the talk indicates, we're going to be talking about taking happiness seriously. So let me give you a case. Happiness matters. It can be measured just by asking people how we feel. Our predictions about happiness are often wrong. So these, I think, give us a case for taking happiness seriously. So using the research on happiness to set our priorities. Now, I don't think any of these ideas are really new or radical. The idea that happiness matters is basically as old as time, at least as old as ethics. The idea that we should focus on it and try and work out what the priorities are is an Enlightenment idea which stretches back to people like Adam Smith and Jeremy Bentham. But the idea of taking happiness seriously it hasn't really been possible until recently. So what is new is the fact that there is now a large body of scientific research, often referred to as subjective well-being research, which comes out of psychology and economics, where we just ask people how happy and satisfied they are with their lives, and because that's grown, we actually now know quite a lot about what makes people happy in a scientifically sensible way, and so we can take happiness seriously and work out what the priorities are. But this isn't something that we have done. This isn't something that we've done so far. So there is the research available, but actually the combination of global priorities research, finding out what are the most effective ways to do good, and the research from subjective well-being, these have not yet been combined. So what are the most cost-effective ways to increase happiness? Like, we don't know, and I and my team are involved in pushing that forward and trying to work out what they are. So I don't think these ideas are new and radical, but implementing them could be. And as I will hopefully try and convince you that this could make quite a substantial difference to our priorities. And at scale, the project of taking happiness seriously is enormously important. So we often, in effective altruism, talk about how it's important to do things which are neglected, that no one else is doing. But we spend an enormous amount of resources around the world through government policy, through charity, trying to affect the lives of other humans. So if we can improve our decision-making just a bit, and I think we can improve it by quite a lot, then this is a project of enormous scale and scope, and so very important. Right, so I had my three premises. Happiness matters. We can measure it just by asking people how they feel. Our predictions about happiness are often wrong. And as you might expect, the structure of the talk is going to be explaining those and then talking about some of the implications. Right, so to kind of get the juices flowing, here's a real-life case. You're finding yourself thinking, like, for about $7,500, you could double the income of 7 households for a year through direct cash transfers. You could save an expectation, 1 life, through 1,500 bed nets, or you could treat 60 women for depression through 10 sessions of group therapy. Now, what I want to ask is the implicit questions which we tend not really to ask, which is, okay, what we want to do in principle is do the most good, but actually what do we mean by good? And how are we going to measure that? Usually we just don't really think about these things. We think it's just sort of a matter of just kind of like counting things in and out and doing just kind of objective measurement. But actually there are these kind of deep philosophical questions which now I want to press on and we don't usually discuss. Okay, so what matters? Well, one thing that clearly matters is well-being. So well-being refers to what is ultimately or intrinsically good for you, what makes your life go well. So things like health and wealth we tend to think of as instrumentally good for us. So the reason you want to be wealthier is not because being wealthier in itself is good for you, but because it helps you get what ultimately matters. Okay, and what are those things? So what we're doing here is like starting right at the very sort of foundational questions in value, and then we're gonna get to the importance of happiness in a moment. So there are three standard of theories philosophers have of well-being. That's preference, satisfaction. Your life goes well to the degree that you get what you want, even if you don't experience it. So you want to achieve success. If you do achieve success but you don't find out, that's still good for you. If you don't want your partner to cheat on you, and they do but you don't find out, that could still be counter to your preferences. There's hedonism, so your life goes well to the degree that you're happy. You have positive experiences which feel good to you. So there's this kind of common language use of hedonist as someone who drinks and parties hard. But this is the kind of person that might go to a German bunker party called What We Owe Ourselves. But this is hedonism in the philosophical sense, just to say that what makes life go well is your feelings, your mental states, rather than your desires. And third is the objective list. And the idea is that there's more to life than your desires and your experiences. Maybe there are some other things which make your life go well, even if they don't make you happier, even if you don't desire them, like love, knowledge, success. And okay, so these are the three theories. And what I could do, but I'm not going to do, is argue for hedonism. So hedonists in the sort of philosophical seminar room means those who think that all that makes people's lives go well is their happiness. But in fact, you don't need to be a hedonist to think that happiness matters. I mean, hedonists think that that's the only thing which matters. But on any of the other views of well-being, your happiness is going to matter somewhere. So if your desires matter, well, probably one of the things you do desire is going to be not to be miserable and to enjoy your life. On the objective list, happiness is probably going to feature somewhere as well. So I find that in the stuff I do, I don't have to convince people that happiness matters. I need to remind them that they already think it matters and that they can take it seriously. So there's this joke. I don't know how well this will work for a German audience, but there's a joke that the Puritans, this very stringent religious sect, is the fear that someone somewhere is happy. And I think we should not be Puritans. Happiness is worth taking seriously. People think it's kind of sort of like woolly-minded or not really serious, but like what matters, or what is more serious than people not having suffering and having lives that they enjoy? If we don't care about that, what do we care about? So I'm not going to convince you that happiness is the only thing which matters, and I don't need to. I just need to convince you that you want to count it somewhere, but that actually you do really need to count it. Okay, so hopefully I've got you on board with the uncontroversial idea that happiness matters, but do we take it seriously now? And the answer is no, not really. So when we do we do think about cost effectiveness, both inside and outside effective altruism. A well-worn approach to cost effectiveness is the QALY. For those of you who are on Twitter, you may get this reference. And so a QALY is a standardized measure of health. And so there are different health states, and these get a QALY score. So a year of perfect health would be 1. A year of being blind would be 0.5. So 2 years of being blind would be 1 QALY, which would be counted as good as 1 year of healthy life. And these are based on hypothetical trade-offs, which will be relevant later, where you're getting, and there's a similar measure, the DALY, the disability adjusted life year, which is much the same. And you're basically asking people to say, hey, like, how bad do you think it would be to be blind, or to walk with a limp, or to have cancer? And that's how people are making the trade-offs on the basis of their sort of intuitive hot takes. Another approach is so health is going to be one of the things which instrumentally is important. I don't think many people think that health matters in itself, but lots of health stuff does matter, and so that's going to capture lots of things, but we don't only care about health. The approach that Give, Well, Take focuses on income. compared to extending lives. And so the way GiveWell think about it is they say to save a life at different ages is equivalent to a certain number of multiples of doubles consumption, okay? So if saving a child's life from 5 to 9 is as good as doubling the income of 134 people for a year. Okay, so this is an attempt. Again, it's based on sort of people's preferences, from beneficiaries to donors, of how are you going to trade these things off against each other. But notice that happiness does not feature here directly. This is income and saving lives. What are the problems with these current approaches? These are just kind of, I showed you the giveaway, but when we think about measuring social progress, we tend to do that in terms of GDP, not GWB, general well-being. So, when we think about comparing stuff to try and work out how much we help other people, we tend to focus on these objective things, and happiness is not yet in the picture. So health and wealth aren't all that matters, even though those are, but we do use them. And even if we did use them, even if we did really care about them, we still want a principled way to compare health and wealth to other things and to other sorts of outcomes. So, something like feeling lonely, or crime, or war, or injustice. These are things which if you're trying to measure these in terms of income and happiness, in terms of income and health, you're like not really capturing the thing which is important. And so we do think that happiness matters. Unless we're going to use some evidence on happiness, then we're just guessing. We're just putting our intuitions to work to try and make some assumptions about what helps other people. Okay, so the sort of thing you might think is like, okay, well, of course we care about happiness in principle. I mean, that one wasn't a hard sell. But the problem is that, I mean, we can't measure it. It's a feeling. It's too subjective. So we have to use those other things because we can't measure the thing which we really care about, or one of the things which ultimately we really care about. But it turns out you can measure happiness just by asking people how happy they are. There are some other questions. So these are from the Office of National Statistics in the UK, which for the last 10 years has been asking about 300,000 people each year, 4 different questions. So these are sort of fall under the umbrella of subjective well-being. Usually that's how they're referred in economics and psychology. The Office of National Statistics sometimes calls them personal well-being. And there's different bits of these. And these are, so people are asking a 0 to 10 scale, these different questions. So that's the sort of, on the right-hand side is the 10, on the left-hand side is the 0, and this is the frequency. So overall, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? You see, like most people say they're a 7. To what extent do you feel things in your life are worthwhile? Blah, blah, blah. And then there's how happy did you feel yesterday? How anxious did you feel yesterday? You can see how that one goes the other way. So it's put the other way around. So these are some measures. Now there have been millions of people around the world that have been asked these sorts of questions. And so you can do it, and I'll just try and in a moment explain why I think we can take these sorts of things seriously. But some of you perhaps don't really need convincing that this is sensible. Okay, so we're used to doing cost effectiveness in terms of QALYs and DALYs. By we, I mean people who spend lots of time worrying about cost effectiveness. So those aren't really measuring what matters, and they're measuring it on the basis of hypothetical trade-offs. We'll come back to that. So I think we should move from the QALY and DALY to the well-being adjusted life year. So goodbye to QALY the light bulb. And one well-being would be a 1-point increase for one person for 1 year. So if I go from 6 out of 10 to 7 out of 10 for 1 year, that would be, say, 1 well-being. So we already do this sort of stuff. Let's do it a bit better. Let's measure what matters. Okay, so can we rely on subjective measures? Of course, you can ask people questions like, how happy were you yesterday? But do they really tell you how happy the person was yesterday? Should we trust this sort of stuff? And so because people have been worried about the scientific validity and reliability of subjective measures, there's now been lots of research to check if they work. And the basic idea is that because you don't necessarily you can't measure a feeling, you can't directly measure the feeling. Someone could just tell you how they feel, but you don't know what people are feeling. You can just measure objective stuff. What you do is you test it and you see if it kind of works in a way which makes sense. So we find that people who are richer report higher happiness and life satisfaction. People in better states of health and better self-reported health. Being in a relationship is associated with higher happiness and life satisfaction. There's a correlation between what your friends say in these reports, how often you smile, and people who are happier and more satisfied are less likely to commit suicide. So what this tells us is that actually these things do seem to be picking up the thing that we think they are. Here's a kind of a map of life satisfaction across the world. And you can see that there's sort of a believable pattern between countries where you'd expect people's lives to be going better and people expect lives to be going worse. So if people in, say, Afghanistan were reporting that they were on average 9 out of 10, that would lead us to be quite worried that people in Afghanistan were answering questions in very different ways. But it looks like there's this sort of general sense of how's my life going compared to how I think it could go, and that there's something kind of real there. People can sometimes worry, exactly how seriously should you take the numbers? Could we really tell if, what's the difference between a 6 and a 6.1? And we can sort of worry about, sort of differences in questions, but we can see there's at least like a coherent kind of broad pattern that really there is something different going on here between the countries where people are saying their lives are going well and saying their lives are going badly. It doesn't just all seem to be random noise. Right, so research on subjective well-being has really picked up in the last couple of decades. So people like Jeremy Bentham were talking about doing it in principle, but really this stuff only kind of got going after the Second World War, since there started to be large surveys of how people's lives go, and there's a big lag between someone having a bright idea and then it kind of filtering in. So particularly economists who've driven lots of policy making have been very suspicious of this whole feelings stuff. If you know any economists, you won't be so surprised about that. But this idea is kind of starting to take traction. So I think also it's pushed in part by the feeling that, over the last 50, 60 years, our lives we've been getting much wealthier, but really how much better have our lives been going? And then also related to environmental concerns of, GDP is a measure of economic activity, but we're concerned that in fact we can do many things which are good for GDP but bad for the environment and bad for us. So really we want a different way of measuring social progress. And so there are now sort of some countries which are starting to think, okay, how do we put well-being into policy making? Many of you may quote unquote know that the Scandinavian countries are the happiest in the world. So Finland is the current winner. It was Denmark before then. You can see there's not, to look at the decimal places, there's not an enormous amount of difference between these. But between sort of Belgium and Finland, it's a whole point. And so people sort of quote unquote know this, but the World Happiness Report has only been going for 10 years. And this is asking people about their life satisfaction rather than their happiness, exactly how they feel moment by moment. But these are kind of not such strange bedfellows, happiness and life satisfaction. So yeah, so this has only been going 10 years, and now people are starting to think, okay, we're measuring it, let's take it seriously. Okay, what does that actually mean for our decision making? You might ask the question, okay, happiness matters, we can measure it, maybe, but why bother? Why bother with the research? Is this really necessary? Well, of course, there are just general reasons to bother with research. What works may be different from what we think works. Many of you will have seen this sort of thing. So this is from Toby Ord's The Moral Imperative Towards Cost Effectiveness in Global Health, and this is looking at different sorts of health intervention, and this is measured in kind of standard disability-adjusted life years. And the point is that some of the best things can be enormously better than some of the other things. So it really pays, in general, to be looking for what works. And there are particular issues about how our intuitions about happiness can lead us astray, which just sort of provide further rationale for this. So when I told you that the QALY and the DALY, these health measures, are based on hypothetical choices, and it turns out that if you ask people to choose between moderate anxiety and depression and then some mobility issues, they think these are about as bad in terms of the amount of life they'd be prepared to give up. But when you look at you sort of just see people living their lives, and then you ask them how they feel, and then it looks then actually the mental health, some issues with mental health are associated with about a 10 times bigger effect than the mobility issues are. So there's a difference between what people think matters and then what does. Here's I don't know how well this is going to come out at scale. Okay, so here's another way of sort of showing that there can be these differences. So you ask people a question. When asked in a survey, what percentage of people do you think said that taking all things together, they're very happy or rather happy? Okay, so you ask people. So I would ask you, tell me how you feel, and then I'd ask, okay, what do you think everyone else is going? What percentage of people are going to say that they are happy or very happy? And you can see there's like a really big difference. So the actual share of people that said they're very happy or rather happy is pretty high. But then people think that other people are miserable. So you ask me how I feel, I feel I'm pretty good, but I would think that you lot are miserable. And that's basically what we do. There's a difference. And of course, if people were really good at this, if we really knew what was happening in other people's lives, then all these things would be on the red line. So big losers here being South Korea, who are really happy, but just don't believe it. Okay, so I've told you that we get it wrong, but I haven't yet told you why we get it wrong. So that's the next bit. Okay, so researchers often have found we're often mistaken when predicting feelings. Oh, funny enough, that's what I just said. Okay, so this is in psychology. This is known as failures of affective forecasting. So affect is how you feel, and it turns out that we're good in some ways, but not in others. So when you ask people to make these forecasts for their later selves or for other people, the thing we get right is whether something is going to feel good or bad. So if you get broken up with, is that going to be good or bad? If you get a promotion, is that going to be good or bad? But the thing we're less good at is the duration and intensity. Duration and intensity. So basically, we display an impact bias. We think things are going to be much worse and for longer than they really are. And what's going on here? So if I ask you to imagine that you're sitting on a beach eating an ice cream sundae, you can do it. And that's, it's a sort of superpower. We can engage in these simulations of other realities, and we can do so effortlessly. But as of course we know, we have biases. When we're trying to do something difficult, we often take shortcuts. And this is the sort of thing that happens when we're making intuitive judgment about how other people's lives go. So one of these is called by Daniel Kahneman and others, focusing illusions. So if you ask people, how much of their time are rich people happy, how much of the time are poor people happy? This is from America. And then you ask the people themselves, and people really overpredict how happy the rich are and how unhappy the poor are. And Kahneman and Co.'s explanation is that when we do these mental time travels, the things which are easier to imagine, we focus on certain things, the things which are easier to imagine, so wealth being one, are just they draw more of our attention, and so we overweight the things which are salient. Another bit is immune neglect. So when we do this mental time travel, we forget to account for the fact that we will adapt to some things and not others. So being mentally ill, being in pain, these keep being bad, whereas some other thing, having say some mobility issues, you might just withdraw your attention from it and you stop noticing it. This is part of the reason that the sort of the QALY and DALY approach is something we need to be quite worried about, assuming that happiness matters, because our intuitive assessments are what qualities and values are based on, but actually they're not very good. So what we're doing is we're trying to put ourselves in other people's shoes, and we're okay at it, but not very good at it, and we can be systematically biased in how we do it, and that's why we need to take how people feel during their lives much more seriously rather than relying on our own assessments. Here's another bit which is kind of surprising and motivates concern. So if you look at the red line, this is GDP per head in $1,000. There we are. And then if you look at the dotted line, this is average subjective well-being scores. These are from different countries, so UK, US, Germany, Australia, across kind of a few decades. And you can basically see that the pattern is that GDP per head is going up, but average well-being measured in some slightly different ways is basically flat. And okay, so there's this thing known as the Easterlin paradox, which is that richer people are happier than poorer people, richer countries are happier than poorer countries, but over the course of time, as countries get wealthier as a whole, at least once they're sort of developed enough, then it looks like average subjective well-being doesn't really seem to move. And so part of what's going on there is that people are thinking like, well, if I were richer, then that would make my life better. But what we forget is that we adapt to some things, but we keep comparing ourselves to others. So I flew here a couple of days ago. I've been on a couple of flights this year. The first flight I went to after COVID started, that was very exciting. I was paying attention to the wheels lifting off and so on. But the flight I was on a couple of days ago, I barely even noticed. I was on my laptop trying to plan my talk. And then we keep comparing ourselves to others. That never goes away. If you have a nice shiny new iPhone, then the fact that my phone also does many of the same things, but is slightly less shiny and fancy, that will nevertheless great. Thanks. So the fact that our increasing economic growth does not seem to be really moving the needle on how people feel during and about their lives is cause for concern and suggests, to bang the drum, we ought to be taking happiness seriously. Oh, look, there's my next slide. Great. But we're not doing so yet. So there's a gap here. There are sort of well-being researchers, people who, in economics and psychology, who look at subjective well-being. There are these global priorities researchers, but there's not kind of a fusion of the two. So I did a philosophy PhD, and I was interested in the Effective Altruist project. But I was also aware of this research on well-being, and it really just surprised me that there was nothing which joined them. And that's what I thought, okay, well, look, surely the thing we care about is happiness. Why aren't we basing our priorities in those terms? And equally, so there isn't yet thinking about this in philanthropy, inside or outside effective altruism, and policymakers are just sort of starting to think about it. Okay, how would we measure it? What might it imply? But the rubber hasn't really sort of hit the road in terms of, okay, this is what, we know what a well-being budget would look like, and we're going to do it, and here's the results. So this is my team. I've been running Happy Lives Institute for now 3 years, just up to a team of 7, and we're trying to push the conjunction of doing the most good and focusing on happiness. We're trying to bring those things together. Okay, so what I've done up till now is paint you this sort of picture of oh, okay, well, maybe this is something we should look at. Maybe it could make a difference. But I haven't told you or given you any evidence to show that it really does change our priorities. So that's the next bit. And like I say, the approach to trying to do effective altruism or trying to do global priorities had not yet been done in terms of well-being. So yeah, very little work on this in both policymaking and in philanthropy. So we thought, okay, what would be really worthwhile would be to take things which are currently regarded as top priorities, and then basically replicate the analysis, but do it in terms of well-being, and then see if we get the same result. So we compared 2 interventions: cash transfers, so providing maybe a sort of $1,000, could be a year's household income to those to very poor families, the type done by Give Directly, and then providing treatment for depression. So group therapy, this would be lay health workers, so not highly trained psychiatrists, and people would come together and for once a week for a number of weeks and do group therapy. So cash transfers, people used to think were a totally mad idea, like a few years ago. So, you know, if people approaching international development, they think, okay, what we want to do is give people, we want to teach people how to fish, not give them a fish. Giving people money is surely the ultimate example of giving them a fish. But now cash transfers have been well studied, they're highly regarded. And now there's a sort of a challenge as to, if your international aid program can't do better than cash transfers, just do cash transfers. And then mental health, not currently regarded as a serious contender for a way to effectively help others. Okay, so for those of you who are really interested in the details of cost effectiveness, listen in. For those of you who are not, just wait till the next slide. But this is what we did. So we did 2 meta-analyses. So we looked at the studies for one intervention and then for the other intervention, and tried to hoover together the research. So we looked in low and middle income countries for studies on lump sum or monthly cash transfers, for lay or group therapy. We found over 80 studies with a total of 140,000 participants between them. So this is like, you know, this is not just like sort of one study with 10 people. This is quite a lot of evidence. And that's why you do the bringing together lots of data. And we looked at, we had measures of subjective well-being, but mostly sort of standardized mental health questions. We had the outcomes in terms of standard deviations of mental health scores. So I'm not going to explain what standard deviations are, but it's like a standard measure of how effective is your intervention. And then what we say is that about a 1 standard deviation change of on mental health scores we think is about equivalent to a 2 points on a life satisfaction scale. So going up from, say, a 6 out of 10 to an 8 out of 10. I did say if you don't like cost effectiveness, tune out. So we looked at the effects over time, the spillover effects on households, not something which usually gets considered either, the cost per treatment, obviously, and then we did some accounting for uncertainty with a Monte Carlo simulation, which I'm also not going to explain. So this is the sort of thing that it looks. You take all the different studies, and then you have sort of information on the different bits. You have the sort of the standardized measure of effect size, and then you're kind of looking at these in each case, and then you're taking these together to go for an average effect. And here's what we found looking at the effect per treatment. So the sort of story is here that the therapy has a big effect initially, but it fades over the course of time, and it goes after about 5 years, whereas the lump sum cash transfer has a smaller effect at the start, but it lasts much longer. So that was kind of what we discovered when we tried to put the time effects together. I don't know how well this has come out, but so what we then also want to do is to look at the uncertainty and to look at the costs. Okay, so we've got the cash transfers here. So costs you slightly more than $1,000 to deliver a $1,000 cash transfer. The spread of dots in each case is representing the uncertainty we had when we stuck this stuff into our models. And yeah, so then what we find is that so this is on the y-axis is the effect. And so what I showed you in the last slide is the effect turns out to be kind of the same. There's not a big difference in the per person effect, but it's more than $1,000 to deliver a $1,000 cash transfer, whereas the therapy, it looks like it's about $130 to deliver. So here's the same thing presented with less dots. And again, we're sort of crunching the numbers in terms of well-bees. And so what I showed you with the first graph is that the overall effect is sort of roughly the same, but it's just the therapy is much cheaper. And that's how we get to the result that the therapy ends up being about 10 times more cost effective. So when I tell people about this research, I have about 80% of people who think this is like absolutely impossible. There's like no way you would have expected that providing therapy to people who are low-income countries and also depressed, like that's no way that could be more impactful than just providing the money. Those people are, and then there's another 20% of people who think, well, like it's kind of obvious, like if you're interested in suffering, then okay, if people are suffering from depression, then you want to treat that directly rather than provide cash transfers. That's a really long way around the problem. Like not all people who are poor are depressed, and not all people who are depressed are poor. Obviously, these things relate, but one can be a kind of a quicker way to get to the problem. With the problem is unhappiness than the other. Yeah, I think this is very striking, and because it's not what we expect, or at least most of us expect, I think it really motivates the case for taking happiness seriously and for doing more research. Okay, so what's happening next? What are we going to look at? So in the comparison we've done, that's just like a tiny bit of the jigsaw. I think enough to motivate that we ought to do more of this like well-being approach to see what we find. But we want to look at other things. So we're also looking at deworming, at providing anti-malarial bed nets. Hopefully by the end of this year we'll have done that, so we can say we've kind of replicated the GiveWell analysis, but done it in terms of well-being, and then we can see where the chips fall. But we want to go from there. I mean, the broad idea is to find the most effective ways to make lives happier, and then get that picked up by those who can do something about it. So that's people who want to give money to charity, that's by governments, and anyone in between. And we want to not just look at the small stuff, but also look at the level of policy change, so systemic interventions, improving our institutional decision making. There's some. It turns out that when you do this well-being stuff, there's some theoretical questions you need to wrestle with as well. So work on how exactly should you compare improving lives to saving lives. Is your 7 out of 10 the same as my 7 out of 10? Do we really care about happiness or life satisfaction? What difference does it make? How should we account for sort of moral uncertainty and worldview diversification? How does this doing good now stuff relate to long-termism? Okay, so I've given you the case for taking happiness seriously. Happiness matters. We can measure it. Our predictions about happiness are often wrong, and that means we should be looking seriously at the research and relying on that rather than our intuitions, and relying on that rather than health or wealth to work out what the priorities are. We don't have to only use happiness research, but given it's one thing we care about, it should be something that features in our decision making and is currently sadly absent. So I said at the start, these aren't new or radical ideas, but they could have radical implications. And you can help. So with what you do with your donations, with your career, there is plenty of scope to try and find ways to contribute to making lives happier. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. We have a few minutes now for Q&A, so we will do that via Swapcard. For those who don't know, you can go onto the Swapcard talk event, and there is a button called live discussion, I think. In some phones, it's also just 2 speech bubbles symbol, and you can post your questions there, and you can upvote other people's questions. So please post your questions there. We have one question already. So the first question is, first of all, for context, from your talk, the person says, I gather that raised GDP for a developed country doesn't increase individual well-being on average. Is your impression that somebody who outpaces the increase in earnings of their peers actually has an increase in happiness over time?
Yes, so there is on an individual level, there is an effect of income on both happiness, how you feel during the moment, and life satisfaction. There's actually been some new research on this. So it looks like, you will be happier if you earn more. It's not obvious that drops off at any point. There was some research by Daniel Kahneman and Angus Deaton, which formally their conclusion was that at $65,000 per head, this was in 2008, after that point, you're not going to get any happier in terms of your sort of daily emotional experience. But some more recent research has suggested that maybe it is. But yeah, there is this thing that basically if you we understand the importance of status and comparison. That's the kind of beings that we are. Polar bears live by themselves and probably don't get lonely, probably don't get envious, but humans, we live in groups, we're comparative, we rely on each other to survive. So yes, the fact that if for people who are wealthier, a large part of their enjoyment comes from the fact they are wealthier than others rather than wealthy, and there's going to be a corresponding cost to those who are less wealthy.
Okay, the next question is the life satisfaction scale linear, exponential, or something else? Is it as easy to get from a 2 to a 4 as it is from getting from an 8 to a 10, and does it matter for your calculations?
Okay, good nerdy question. So briefly, I think we should treat the happiness scales as roughly linear. So the difference between a 2 and a 3 and a 7 and an 8 is about the same. But this is nothing fancy to do with like the intricacies of statistics. This is just how we communicate with language. So we use, is the difference between a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and a 5 on your restaurant rating, like, is that conveying the same amount of information or not? For people who are interested, I've got a paper on this, on the working paper on the Happy Lives Institute website, which goes into all of this in extremely grim and boring detail. And if people want to nerd snipe me about it at some later point, I'm often happy to discuss cardinality issues. So there's a bit of an open question there. I mean, basically, what I showed you with the international picture is it does look like if a country says it's 3 out of 10 or 7 out of 10, like that, there's something clearly going on there which is real. But is there a difference between a 7.16 and a 7.58? Like, okay, maybe we can't be so confident over that. But in broad terms, it seems like this is capturing something important, and like that's what you need to make decisions. There's always kind of error in measurement.
All right. Next question. Do you worry that happiness research increases focus on local short-term well-being in the timescale of 1 to 10 years versus structural longer-term problems like the lack of democracy?
No. But should I? I mean, now you've invited me to answer the question. So actually, here's a place that well-being research. It's going to take me too long to go back through it. Maybe it's not. So what you can do in the international level is, because there are differences between countries, you can statistically make some guesses as to which things explain the difference. And so things like quality of governance look good. So democracy per se doesn't seem to show up so well. And what was it I wanted? Yeah, it's this one. So here in the world, if you're interested in this sort of international comparison stuff, you want to go to the World Happiness Report. And so they try and explain the different endline scores by accounting for, they've got 6 factors. One of them is quality of governance, another is GDP. I'm not sure I can remember what the other 4 are off the top of my head. But yeah, by taking a well-being approach, you can start to tease out like how important is it to have this sort of stuff. Whereas if you're just going to try and measure outcomes in terms of income or health, then you're really none the wiser about how to account for the value of things like democracy.
Okay, we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. What evidence is there that the well-being scale means the same thing for different people? In other words, is my 7 out of 10 the same as your 7 out of 10? How do you test this?
So I've already sort of half answered that question, so I think I'm going to not half answer it again.
What do you think of David Pearce's approach of large-scale pharmacological or biochemical enhancement of happiness?
What do I think of this? I'm not sure I could give you chapter and verse on what David Pearce's approach is. I think the idea is something like, look, Mother Nature built us to survive rather than to be happy. There are kind of, things like hedonic adaptation, getting used to things, comparing ourselves to others. These are essential tools to try and help us navigate, but could we radically re-engineer our consciousness so that we can just kind of be happier all the time and sort of defeat, quote unquote, Mother Nature? So I think there might be some kind of like promise to the bits of the research agenda. I mean, we use drugs in like all sorts of things, both like recreationally and medically. Like, painkillers seem like they're often useful. Antidepressants seem like they're often useful. So clearly the use case is already there, and maybe there are some kind of more counterintuitive things out there too. So, like, for instance, I used to be more interested in psychedelics as a treatment for mental health. I think so I was interested in this about 6 years ago, gave an EA Global talk then when I sort of sounded the drum, banged the drum, sounded the alarm on why this might be important. I think the research which has come out on that has actually been somewhat underwhelming in terms of really how much better. No, I don't think they've really lived up to the hype. But if we can get kind of better tools in the cabinet for dealing with ways of alleviating suffering, then I think we should be prepared to look in the corners of the cabinet.
Okay, thank you so much. We are out of time now, so sorry to everyone whose questions didn't get answered.
But I do have office hours from 3 till 4 somewhere, so if you want to come and heckle me, then you're more than welcome to do so.
Yeah, good point. So yeah, thank you again.
Right, thanks.